Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Russell, and we are going to begin our introductory lesson on the ancient Greeks. Now, before we begin our lesson and start looking at Greece in general, what we're going to do is we're going to take a little pit stop at the little island of Crete out in the Mediterranean, and we're going to sort of focus on a group of people called the Minoans. The Minoans are definitely an interesting group. There's not a tremendous amount that we do know about them, but we have discovered some ruins. There are a few artifacts that were discovered. So we are going to do our best to put the pieces together and understand a little bit more about this particular culture. So, all right, let's get started. Now, as far as the island itself, if you notice that down the bottom here, the island of Crete, this is going to be our focal point. And what we're going to notice is that in early civilizations, everyone was looking for this westward migration. At times you move west, you would find greener pastures, more land, more opportunities. It's pretty much the same thing that most people, even in today's standards, they want to move west and life particularly gets better. So in this case, we have some early Sumerians, we have people from Babylonia, we even have some Egyptians doing this westward migration, and the first settlement pattern is going to be the island of Crete. Now, what makes this island a stopping point, and even a few others, and why don't you just go to the mainland of Greece? The mainland of Greece, what we're going to learn a little bit later, is a very mountainous, very rocky area. There's very little farmland. But if you were to travel to the Mediterranean, even in today's standards, the islands themselves are magnificent. They're absolutely beautiful islands, and it is one of the top tourist attractions in today's standards. People want to go to these islands in the Mediterranean just because of their sheer beauty and what they have to offer. So, as far as the Minoans are concerned, it completely makes sense on why they actually wanted to go there. But when we look at the island and the people that actually live there, we're going to show you a couple pictures here of a frescoes. Now, frescoes is essentially a artwork that was created by the early Minoans, and what you will notice by these frescoes is that the people look a bit odd. Okay, I noticed they seem a bit oddly shaped, but what we did find, there were actually some artifacts found that actually describe the Minoan people. Um, Dark skin, dark hair was essentially their makeup. They did, in fact, wear actual cosmetics, just like the Egyptians. They wore makeup, both men at times, but mostly women would often wear makeup. Again, they would use certain dyes from rocks. They would crush that on a steel, and they would mix it with animal fat, and there you have makeup. And essentially, that's what they would use. They were also noticed for their very thin waistlines. It was a very common thing. It was a almost like a sign of beauty for someone to have a very thin waistline, almost you could say an abnormally thin waistline. And at times, to get that figure, they would tie a belt around their waist and keep it there. And essentially, as you begin to mature and as you begin to grow, that belt stays put, doesn't move, and essentially contracts the hip line, and almost like it's deforming it. We could often compare it to the pad-on women who you ever seen images of the pad-on women who are putting rings around their necks, and it looks like the neck is getting longer, but in reality, it's actually compressing the shoulders. So it's essentially deforming the shoulders, and it's very similar. It's a very common practice even in the early civilizations of Asia. Women were typically known to put their feet in wooden crocs, these wooden shoes, in which, as they begin to mature and grow, their feet were basically confined into these small shoes. And yes, it caused the foot to deform, but it kept foot sizes very small. So the early Minoans were also seafaring people. They would often look for places to travel and trade, looking for different antiquities and spices. And the issue that they had is that the Minoans were not a very aggressive group of people. They're not going to be forming any type of military. They're not going to be invading. So one hiccup that they're going to encounter are pirates. And pirates actually did exist in the Aegean Sea at this time period, and their ships would often get invaded, and the Minoans would get robbed and lose all of their antiquities. So they had to essentially re-engineer their boats. And as you can see a picture down here, we'll show you another closer up right here. Um, the boat itself would be longer and sleeker, a little more aerodynamic. It's going to have two separate sails on it, and as you can see here, they're adding a separate bank of rowers. So you're almost doubling the amount of rowers that you could potentially have. And their goal was, as they were traveling through the Aegean or even parts of the Mediterranean, if they would in fact see pirates, they would just go ahead and set sail. Sails go up, all oars go in the water, and they begin paddling away as fast as they can, and then they basically outrun their enemy, and that's how they were able to sort of avoid conflict as well. Now, as far as the mainland is concerned, when you're on an island, there's not a tremendous amount to do. So farming and fishing is actually going to be a huge commodity for the early Minoans. They are going to rely very heavily on some of the granaries and the pithies, that I'll show you in a little bit what they look like in case of harvesting. Now, as far as leisurely activities, as you can see here in the image in the middle, two guys are actually boxing. Ironically enough, boxing is something that the early Minoans did. They even have a light, middle, and a heavyweight division, and guys would typically fight until one person was almost passed out on the ground. And obviously, I mean, there were some deaths would occur, and people would be pretty banged up. But when someone decided that they could not fight any longer, that's how you determine who was the actual victor. So many people would actually go and watch these boxing matches. And now the picture on the right, we're going to focus on this one. What it looks like there's three individual people here, but ironically enough, this is actually a husband and wife uh, partnership, and it's something called bull leaping. Now, this is a another sporting event in which they would at first train one of the bulls and teach it how to react. And in order to do this, the Minoans very early on, they would take a young bull and they would begin feeding him. And as it was feeding, they would grab it by the horns and they would try to maneuver its head and get it used to actually, jerking its head and getting used to people getting close to them. As the bull gets older, they then perform the actual sport of bull leaping. Now, what this entails is a husband and wife, and the husband's going to try to position himself in front of the bull, and the wife is basically going to be behind the bull and almost ready to catch her husband. As you can see there, she's in this sort of receiving position. And the husband will, in fact, grab the bull by the horns, not metaphorically speaking, but figuratively at this point, and he will attempt to catapult himself up off of the back of the bull, flipping off and then essentially into the arms of his wife. And if they did that successfully, then they sort of won that event, and many people would actually go and see it. You can actually go to parts of Western Europe, like Spain and Portugal, and actually see real live bull leaping. The guys are a little more aerobatic, and they're doing flips and things like that over the bulls. But this art form essentially comes from our good friend the Minoans. Now, when we look at a little bit deeper of a micro perspective about uh, the island of Crete, there is one particular ruin, palace, if you will, and it's a place called Knossos. And Knossos is a ruin, and you can see the aerial view here of what the city potentially looked like. And now there is some speculation as to what happened to the city. Some archaeologists say that there was a potential volcanic eruption somewhere out there in the Mediterranean, or even an earthquake that produced a tsunami, and that tsunami ended up washing up onto the shoreline of where Knossos was and destroyed the entire city. Um, that's one particular theory. Hasn't officially been proven. Another theory is that the Mycenaeans, a group that will become the next inhabitants of this area, invaded this city, took over. The only problem is they have not found in the island itself, ironically enough, there were no skeletal remains. They have not found any skeletal remains to warrant a battle or massacre of any point by anyone in particular. So that leaves a little bit of room for doubt. And then, of course, in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about their mythology, and of course, we'll talk about Theseus and the Minotaur, and the Minotaur's demise, and that potentially ending the Minoan people as well. So we'll look at three sort of conflicting ideologies, and we'll let you decide which one you actually believe in. The image on the right here is an artist recreation of what the city potentially looked like based on the frescoes and the colors. The city had beautiful colors. Some of the ruins are still standing, and you can take a look at them in some of the next pictures I have for you. Again, Knossos here, this is a zoomed in picture of what it looked like. If you take notice, it's very, very similar to the Sumerian style of homes. You have 2 and 3 story living. You have a huge courtyard in the middle. It is basically protected on the outer wall, trying to protect the city. You're going to mostly have your middle class living in the interior part of the city, followed by the middle and then the lower class living on the outskirts. And then as you can see out here in the foreground, you're going to have most of your farmland. So the setup of a city-state, in this case in Knossos, is very similar to that of an early Sumerian city-state. Now, as we go a little bit deeper inside the palace itself, again, it's a ruin, but there are still some walls, and you can still see some frescoes still standing today. Different rooms that you can actually go in. You can see the columns, and there was a tremendous amount of artwork that was placed and a fair amount of stonework, and which is not surprising, again, because some of our friends, the Egyptians, moved from North Africa to the island, looking for ways to expand, and therefore it explains why some of the stonework is very well done, very, very meticulous. Again, we have a covered walkway here, some entrance ways into, some of the homes, and then the support columns. So again, the engineering is very well put together. Something happened years ago which caused a tremendous amount of damage, but there's still just a little bit of the city that is actually still, in fact, standing today. This here was an actual pithos. It's a container that was essentially found. There were quite a few of these, and this jar is actually a fairly decent size. We mentioned earlier that the Minoans were farmers and fishermen, and what they would typically do is they would farm for quite a bit of time, and they would put a lot of the grains or wheats, olives, olive oil, and they would put them in these pithos jars and save them in what's called a granary, which best way I can describe that to you is to think if you're a farmer and you're trying to keep some of your corn or like weeds and things of that nature, you put it in a silo, right? Well, here you had something very similar. There was an area blocked off in the palace, and you would have these pithos jars, and you would essentially fill all those jars up with different foods and goods in case you had a bad harvest, and your people could continue on and continue to eat. So these jars, tell us a lot about their culture and the things that they did, and even about some of their farming practices and techniques and what they actually grew on this island. Here is another picture. Now this is the actual granary itself. As you can see here, it's got rows of these pithos jars, and again, they're of decent size. And this is where you would keep all of your grains and olive oils and barleys and make breads and so forth. And in case you had that harvest, you could come to this area and you could get all the resources that you needed. So living on an island out there in the Aegean, you're pretty isolated, so you're going to have to rely on being self-contained and self-sustaining, and making sure that you have all the foods that you're going to need in order to survive. The actual engineering of the Minoans was actually pretty impressive. Some you could say even a little bit before their time, because in some of the ruins, in some of that areas of the Palace of Knossos, they actually had little wells, and the wells could actually heat up and they could cool down. So they could actually provide people running water inside their home, and it could be hot or warmer, and it could actually be cooler. So you could warm up the water, you could cool it down. So that was definitely a plus, something that most other civilizations did not actually have. And as you can see here in the middle, this image here is a piece of terracotta piping. Actually, believe it or not, terracotta piping is still used today in most residential neighborhoods to flush away wastewater from neighborhoods. So as using appliances in your home, and the wastewater that you generate goes out of their home and it goes in terracotta piping down the street and then eventually to a waste treatment plant. So the engineering process and the materials have not really changed, and this was essentially invented by our good friend the Minoan. So parts of the Palace of Knossos actually had indoor plumbing, which is a huge benefit when you talk about sanitation and just the way that people actually lived in this society. Here is a picture, an image of a three-headed goddess. The Minoans were very religious. Their main focal religious figure was actually someone called Mother Earth. She was depicted as a woman standing. You could almost describe her as being Medusa. It was not Medusa, but she would kind of look like that, and she would be holding snakes in either hand and kind of holding up to her side there, shoulder height. And the Mother Earth was the actual person of worship, and these three goddesses here are to represent the idea of Mother Earth and watching over the Minoan people. Here is another sort of caption. We'll look through just a couple pictures of the actual ruin of the city itself. As you can see, I mean, the Palace of Knossos was not overly large. It was definitely smaller than some of the other palaces that we're used to seeing, but they engineered it pretty well. And of course something happened here that we're just not quite sure of that ended up destroying this palace. A couple walls here that are still essentially left unscathed that uh, just kind of withstood that test of time here. One other important element that was found was this something called the Phasos disc. And ironically enough, we were able to decipher many languages. And, when we just talked about recently, even in Egypt with the Rosetta Stone, the fact that it was able to decipher the hieroglyphs, uh, Demotic, which is that shorthand version of hieroglyphs, and then even Greek or Latin, uh, we were able to decipher cuneiform. Um, but this Phasos disc, archaeologists have never been able to figure out what it says. So in 2018, many archaeologists have looked at this and they cannot figure out exactly what this means. So this Phasos disc, the circular disc here, does contain Minoan writing on it. Part of the problem is the Minoans are no longer around. Their civilization was here one day, almost gone the next. Um, their extinction is still a bit of a mystery, and therefore we don't really have any archaeological evidence that has been discovered yet to be able to help us sort of decode this information. So there are archaeologists that are, in fact, on the island of Crete, and they are trying to excavate certain areas to see if they can sort of find a few more pieces to the puzzle to learn a little bit more about this culture and this group. And maybe they could figure out the language. And if they're able to do that, maybe this disc would tell us something a little bit more about their society. Now, the last picture here is an actual throne. So they believe the queen actually stayed here. So you can see there's a picture of her throne. There is a little tub here. It was very customary for people to wash hands and feet every time you were in the presence of royalty. Sometimes you even would wash the queen's feet as a sign of almost like a sign of homage, and it was to pay your respects. And then there was bench seating around the actual throne itself, and so we could think maybe the king or queen, sat here on this throne, conducted business, maybe handled government affairs, But again, we don't really know a lot about their government or any laws that they may have created, or in fact even being able to decipher their language. So the last part is, and what we'll look at, there is a map here, and where we're going next is we're going to focus on the mainland part of Greece. Two city-states in particular is going to be Athens and Sparta. But before we do that, you can see here the Minoans in this blue area are going to be more of our coastal group of people. And, as I alluded to earlier, there is some speculation as to what happened. Was it a physical, some type of physical catastrophe like a tsunami, earthquake, volcanic eruption, something destroyed it? Was it the Mycenaeans, this group here that will emerge into that southern and that central part of Greece? Did they actually invade? You can see that they took over a tremendous amount of territory. And then what we'll do next is in the next part, our next video lesson, we're going to take a look a little bit about their mythology. And one of the very famous stories is good old Theseus and the Minotaur. And we'll tell you exactly what happens there. And the mythological part of it is that when the Minotaur dies, so do the Minoan people. So we'll kind of leave you hanging with that teaser there. And we will see you next time. Have a great day, guys.